Women were just as involved in the founding and forming of the United States as men were. One of the strongest founding women of the United States was the explorer and Native American Indian woman named Sacagawea of the Lamy tribe of the Shoshone Indian Nation from the present-day state of Fort Hall, Idaho, and she was the heroine of the Corps of Discovery Lewis and Clark expedition. Despite having been kidnapped as a young girl at the age of 10 by the enemy Hidatsa tribe and then taken to North Dakota and later being sold by the Hidatsa tribe as a wife to the French-Canadian frontiersman Toussaint Charbonneau, Sacagawea displayed immense and impressive strength, bravery, courage, perseverance, determination, willpower, and confidence while on the Corps of Discovery expedition with former military captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Were it not for the help of Sacagawea on the Lewis and Clark expedition, several times Lewis and Clark would have gotten lost, starved to death, froze to death, burned to death, been killed by an animal, been killed by an Indian, or died of disease. But because Sacagawea did help them, all explorers on the Lewis and Clark expedition survived and came back to tell of their discovery to President Thomas Jefferson. Sacagawea had worked on the Lewis and Clark expedition as their guide in the unknown wilderness and as their language interpreter to the Native American Indian tribes. Without her help, Lewis and Clark and their exploring party would not have made it alive all the way from Pennsylvania to the Pacific Ocean and back again. Sacagawea's character remained dignified in spite of having gotten very sick with an obstruction of the menses and in the face of receiving no payment for her work on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Her marriage to Toussaint Charbonneau was possibly slavery, as Sacagawea was only one of 5 of his Native American Indian wives, and because he didn't always treat her well. However, Sacagawea's strong image, which is engraved on American coin money and printed on American postage stamps, is synonymous with discovery, bravery, courage, a new frontier, and certainly a woman's strength in leadership. Sacagawea takes the lead as she directs Lewis and Clark and their traveling party all the way from Pennsylvania to the Pacific Ocean and back again. Sacagawea was a woman founder and explorer of the United States, a strong woman leader, and a brave and courageous frontierswoman. Sacagawea's image from the Lewis and Clark expedition as a strong woman leader, a guide, and an interpreter is strikingly powerful, but so too is how badly she was treated and how badly women have been treated since the beginning of time. Despite Charbonneau not always being very nice to Sacagawea, Sacagawea was the utmost diplomat on the Corps of Discovery expedition. She helped Lewis and Clark communicate with the Native American Indian tribes that they encountered on the trail when she used her Native American language speaking skills as an interpreter. Trail diplomacy, as it was called, facilitated by Sacagawea, opened the door for the United States to engage in commerce and trade with the Native American Indian tribes living in the region. Certainly, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France's Napoleon Bonaparte by the United States would prove to be an economic gain for the United States, as the purchase of the territory opened up economic relations with the Native American Indian tribal nations who were very happy to trade with the Americans. The Americans traded with the Native American Indians in beads and animal furs, and the beaver was discovered to be plentiful in western North America. Animal furs were prized by the British, the French, and the Spanish, and the Americans wanted in on the competition. Taking point against the British, the Americans set out to dismantle the British Northwest Company, as the Americans were not as interested in the fur trade as the Europeans had been. At several points along the trail, the explorers set out to prevent the British from being able to establish trading posts. The Americans were successful, as they were now owners of the Louisiana Territory, and their new counterparts were the Native American Indian tribes. Sacagawea helped Lewis and Clark make clothes out of animal skins that they needed to wear while they were out exploring the wilderness, such as new moccasins that they needed when their moccasins became worn through, caused by damage from walking over prickly pears. The Americans were not as interested in the fur trade as the Europeans had been, but they were very much interested in the Age of Enlightenment. President Thomas Jefferson, one of the men of the Enlightenment, had commissioned the Corps of Discovery expedition as a scientific endeavor, and Lewis and Clark discovered hundreds of new plant and animal species indigenous to North America on their expedition. Some of the indigenous plants to North America that Lewis and Clark discovered were wild roses, elkhorn, bearberry, edible valerian, quaking aspen, camas, prickly pears, biscuit root, beargrass, Jerusalem artichoke, the snowberry, weeds of the Lolo motorway, Oregon grapes, sweetgrass, cowse, the Osage orange, mixed prairie grass, cottonwoods, the bitterroot plant, yucca, fire-loving forests, wild ginger, Douglas fir, glacier lilies, Ravenique's six firs, wapato, lady slipper, and trees, such as Douglas's six firs, western red cedar, and Lewis's five firs. Sacagawea knew how to find edible plants, and she knew how to make food from them. She showed Lewis and Clark how to eat this food when they were traveling on the trail out west. Animals indigenous to North America that were discovered on the Lewis and Clark expedition were bobcats, wolverines, the beached whale, pronghorns, wolves, badgers, eastern gray squirrel, domestic dogs, coyotes, bighorn sheep, mountain beavers. Birds discovered on the Lewis and Clark expedition include the grouse, the bald eagle, the spruce grouse, the sage grouse, the ruffed grouse, the blue grouse, Lewis's woodpecker, Clark's nutcracker, the American white pelican, the western meadowlark, Clark's nightingale, and the sharp-tailed grouse. Lewis and Clark had hunted some of these animals to eat as food when they were exploring out on the trail. Lewis and Clark discovered paleontology when they were exploring on the trail. Mastodons had lived in North America 13,000 years before Lewis and Clark discovered fossil remains of American mastodons. The contributions of Lewis and Clark to the fields of botany and zoology, based on their scientific discoveries in North America, remains remarkable. However, although the Age of Enlightenment was a time of scientific discovery, medicine practice of the early 19th century America was quite antiquated. Despite President Thomas Jefferson being a man of the Enlightenment, there was not a trained medical doctor commissioned to be with the exploring party on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And during the expedition, Lewis and Clark took turns functioning as the medical doctor. Lewis and Clark, neither of whom were trained medical doctors, attempted to assist the sick and wounded while on the Corps of Discovery expedition. With only some very, very basic science knowledge, Lewis and Clark managed to the best of their abilities out in the wilderness without a trained medical doctor. The first need of medical assistance was when Lewis was attacked by a grizzly bear. Without having a trained medical doctor with them, the party treated Lewis's wounds. The second need for a medical doctor was when Sacagawea got sick with an obstruction of the menses 4 months after giving birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste. Sacagawea was smart. She gave birth on the trail at Fort Mandan in present-day Washburn, North Dakota on February 11, 1805, to her first child with Charbonneau, a son, who they give the French name of Jean-Baptiste, and she was only 16 years old. Their medical treatment for Sacagawea was to give her barks and opium and water from a sulfur spring. Sacagawea survived both the gonorrheal infection and the antiquated medical practices of the time. She handmade a cradle board to carry her 8-week-old son, Jean-Baptiste, on her back, and this is how he was carried while on the trail. Sacagawea survived getting very sick, and she survived the antiquated medical practices of early 19th century America. She knew how to survive in the wilderness, and she took care of her son, Jean-Baptiste, when he got sick, possibly with tonsillitis or mumps. The third need for a medical doctor was when Jean-Baptiste got sick. They put a poultice of onions on Jean-Baptiste's neck, and despite this antiquated ritual, he survived both being sick and the outdated medical regimen. Sacagawea used traditional Native American Indian and Shoshone Indian practices in the care of herself, her son, and for the members of the Lewis and Clark Exploring Party. The Shoshone tribal nation had taught survival skills to Sacagawea that she had used while on the trail with the exploring Lewis and Clark Party. She knew how to gather edible foods from the woods, such as edible roots, artichokes, herbs, berries, seeds, and she knew how to dry meats for preserving and eating. Native American Indian women and women of the Shoshone Indian tribal nation were the fabrics of their cultures, and so too was Sacagawea. The Shoshone tribal women worked from dawn until dusk, gathering food, preparing it for storage, scraping and curing skin hides, erecting shelters to live in, making bedding to sleep in and clothing to wear, caring for children, and packing for hunting excursions. The Lamy Shoshone tribe reveres Sacagawea as a representative of their tribe and culture, and they are extremely proud of how Sacagawea helped Lewis and Clark on their expedition. Sacagawea represents the best of the Lamy Shoshone tribal nation. Sacagawea helped Lewis and Clark discover new natural landscapes, such as new geography, geology, topography, mountain ranges, rivers, prairies, and meadows. They sailed down the Ohio River, they sailed up the Mississippi River, they went to St. Louis, Missouri, they discovered the Rocky Mountains, Yellowstone National Park, they sailed down the Columbia River, and they finally reached the Pacific Ocean. Sacagawea was able to recognize several of these natural landmarks, and she used her navigation skills as a guide to help Lewis and Clark, directing them along as they traveled the trail. If it wasn't for Sacagawea helping guide Lewis and Clark, several times they would have gotten lost. Lewis and Clark were the first white men to travel in some of these areas. The British had not even discovered these areas before. Only Native American Indian tribes had lived on these lands, and those tribes had no contact with white men until they met Lewis and Clark. As the Lewis and Clark Exploring Party was traveling in a pirogue boat up the Mississippi River, Sacagawea secured herself, her son, and she grabbed boxes of precious materials as the pirogue boat was about to sink. She pulled the boxes back into the boat, and she prevented the party from losing the precious materials. It was at Three Forks of the Missouri in Montana that Lewis and Clark learned of Sacagawea's capture by Hidatsa Indians just 5 years previous. The Lamy Shoshone Indians had a camp at Three Forks of the Missouri in Montana when the enemy Hidatsa tribe attacked the Lamy Shoshones, killing 4 men, 4 women, several young boys, and capturing Sacagawea and several other female Shoshone Indian women. As Lewis and Clark go along the trail, they name spots along the trail that they discover, such as naming the Southwest Fork Jefferson's River after President Thomas Jefferson. The Middle River was named Madison's River after President James Madison, and the Southeast Fork was named Gallatin's River after Albert Gallatin. The heroine of the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark expedition was Sacagawea. Sacagawea guides and leads Lewis and Clark through unknown lands of the American West. Sacagawea was strong, brave, and courageous, all characteristics of a woman in leadership. Without Sacagawea's help, Lewis and Clark and their exploring party would not have traveled alive all the way from Pennsylvania to the Pacific Ocean and back again. Sacagawea was so strong that she made the men on the trail with her look weak. Charbonneau did receive his shaming for his mistreatment of Sacagawea. American history is stronger because of Sacagawea, and her contributions to scientific discovery are worth noting. Sacagawea's image, which is engraved on the American golden dollar coin and printed on the American postage stamp, is a symbol of women's strength, power, and ability. On the golden dollar coin, with Jean Baptiste strapped in a cradle board on her back, Sacagawea's image is that of a woman's might. Sacagawea is in the category of founders of the United States, as her contributions to the discovery of America are remarkable. She is also in the category of women's leaders, as she was the strongest member on the traveling Lewis and Clark expedition. When it comes to founding a nation, Sacagawea knew how to lead, and she pointed in the right direction. The United States does have women founders, and Sacagawea is one of them. Thank you.